Wyatt's heart stopped when the brick shattered the window, glass exploding across the living room like a gunshot in the night. He stood frozen, his boyfriend Ezra's hand trembling in his, as the word faggot scrawled in red spray paint bled across the wall of their Brooklyn apartment. Outside, the jeering voices of strangers grew louder, their hatred a living thing clawing at the edges of Wyatt's world. It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday night. Wyatt, 25, had spent the evening cooking pasta with Ezra, laughing over cheap wine and debating whether jazz or indie rock was the better soundtrack for their lives. They'd been together for 2 years, their love a defiant bloom in the concrete jungle of New York City, where acceptance wasn't guaranteed but felt possible. Wyatt, with his sharp jawline and restless energy, had grown up in rural Georgia, where being gay was a sin whispered about in church pews. Ezra, a graphic designer with a gentle smile and a knack for seeing beauty in chaos, had been his anchor since they met at a Pride event in Manhattan. But tonight, their sanctuary was under siege. The shouting outside grew vicious. "Come out, queers," a voice bellowed, followed by the sickening thud of another projectile hitting the door. Ezra's eyes widened, his grip tightening on Wyatt's hand. "We need to call the police," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear flickering in his brown eyes. Wyatt nodded, but his mind was spiraling. He knew this kind of hate. It wasn't just strangers outside. It was the echo of his mother's voice, the woman who'd raised him with a Bible in one hand and a belt in the other, preaching that his love was an abomination. Wyatt's phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with a name he hadn't seen in months: Mom. His stomach twisted. Margaret Lawson, 52, was a force of nature, unyielding, devout, and fiercely homophobic. She'd disowned Wyatt when he came out at 18, her words cutting deeper than any blade. "You're no son of mine if you choose this sin." He hadn't spoken to her since he left Georgia, but her number flashing now felt like a cruel coincidence. He ignored the call, grabbing his phone to dial 911 instead. "Stay away from the windows," Wyatt said, pulling Ezra toward the back of the apartment. The operator's calm voice on the line was drowned out by another crash outside, a bottle this time, shattering on the pavement. The mob was growing, their chants a venomous chorus. Wyatt's heart pounded as he gave their address, his voice shaking. "They're trying to break in," he said, glancing at Ezra, who was now barricading the door with a chair. The operator promised help was on the way, but the wail of sirens felt impossibly far off. Ezra's hand found Wyatt's again, grounding him. "We're okay," Ezra said, his voice a lifeline. "We've got each other." But Wyatt's mind was racing, memories of his mother's rage colliding with the present. He could still see her standing in their old kitchen, her face contorted as she quoted Leviticus, her hands trembling with fury. She'd thrown him out that night, his belongings stuffed into a duffel bag, her final words a curse: "You'll burn for this." Now, as the mob outside grew louder, Wyatt wondered if she'd been right, not about hell, but about the world's cruelty. The apartment door rattled under a heavy blow, and Ezra flinched. Wyatt pulled him close, their bodies pressed together in the dim hallway. "I love you," Wyatt whispered, the words fierce and desperate. Ezra's lips brushed his forehead, a silent promise. But the moment was shattered by the screech of tires outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the broken window, and the mob's shouts turned to chaos as police sirens cut through the night. Wyatt peered cautiously through a crack in the blinds. 3 cop cars had pulled up, officers spilling out, their voices sharp as they ordered the crowd to disperse. But the mob wasn't backing down. Wyatt saw bottles and rocks flying, one striking an officer's shield. His breath caught as he realized this wasn't just a hate-fueled prank. It was escalating into something dangerous. Ezra's hand tightened on his shoulder. "They're here to help," he said, but his voice wavered. Then, Wyatt's phone buzzed again. "Mom." He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the decline button. Why was she calling now? After years of silence, why tonight? Against his better judgment, he answered, his voice sharp. "What do you want, Mom?" "Wyatt." Margaret's voice was strained, not with anger but something else. "Fear?" "I'm in New York. I'm outside your apartment." Wyatt's mind reeled, the phone trembling in his hand as Margaret's words sank in. His mother here? In Brooklyn, outside his apartment, in the middle of this chaos? "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Ezra shot him a confused look, but Wyatt couldn't explain. Not yet. The noise outside was deafening now, a cacophony of shouts, sirens, and shattering glass. I needed to see you, Margaret said, her voice unsteady, almost drowned out by the commotion. I saw the news. They're talking about a hate crime at your address. Wyatt, I'm scared for you. Wyatt's chest tightened. The news? He hadn't even thought about how fast this could spread. He glanced at Ezra, who was now crouched by the door, listening to the chaos outside. The police were shouting orders, but the mob's anger seemed to feed off their presence, growing louder, more violent. Wyatt's eyes darted to the broken window, where he could see shadows moving in the flickering police lights. And then, impossibly, he saw her, Margaret, standing across the street, her graying hair catching the glow of a street lamp, her face pale and drawn. Stay where you are, Mom, Wyatt said, his voice low but firm. It's not safe. He hung up before she could respond, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, fear, or something softer, something he hadn't felt for her in years. Ezra grabbed his arm. Your mom? She's here. His tone was incredulous, laced with the same wariness Wyatt felt. Ezra knew the stories, how Margaret's rejection had left scars that still ached in Wyatt's quiet moments. I don't know why, Wyatt said, shaking his head. But she's out there. He didn't have time to process it. A loud crack echoed as something heavy hit the door again, and Ezra pulled him back. We can't stay here, Ezra said, his voice urgent. If they break in, he didn't finish the sentence, but Wyatt knew. They were trapped, two gay men in a city that preached tolerance, but couldn't always protect them. The police were trying to control the crowd, but it was clear they were outnumbered. Wyatt risked another glance outside. The mob, maybe a dozen men, their faces twisted with rage, were throwing anything they could find. A bottle sailed past an officer, shattering on the pavement. Wyatt's eyes found Margaret again, still standing across the street, her hands clasped tightly, her face a mask of fear and something else. Guilt? He couldn't tell. Wyatt, we need a plan, Ezra said, pulling him back to the moment. The back exit, through the fire escape? Wyatt nodded, his mind racing. The fire escape led to an alley, but it was a risk. If the mob had spread out, they could be walking into a trap. But staying here wasn't an option either. He grabbed Ezra's hand, leading him toward the bedroom where the fire escape window waited. As they moved, Wyatt's phone buzzed again. A text from Margaret. I'm coming to you. Stay safe. His heart lurched. What was she doing? She was a 52-year-old woman, frail from years of stress and a life of rigid faith. She couldn't face this mob. He typed a quick reply, stay back. But before he could hit send, a deafening crash shook the apartment. The front door splintered, and the shouts from outside flooded in. Ezra now, Wyatt yelled, shoving open the bedroom window. The fire escape creaked under their weight as they climbed out, the cold metal biting into Wyatt's hands. The alley below was dark, but the sounds of the mob echoed from the street. Ezra went first, his movements quick and precise, while Wyatt followed, his heart hammering. He couldn't shake the image of his mother standing out there, alone, in the middle of this nightmare. They reached the alley, crouching behind a dumpster as the chaos from the street spilled closer. Wyatt peeked out, his breath catching as he saw Margaret moving toward the apartment building, her steps hesitant but determined. She was clutching her purse, her eyes scanning the chaos. What was she thinking? She'd spent years condemning him, and now she was here, risking her safety for what? Redemption? Duty? Wyatt didn't know, but the sight of her stirred something deep. Anger, yes, but also a flicker of hope he didn't want to acknowledge. Wyatt, we have to move, Ezra whispered, tugging at his sleeve. But before they could, a group of men from the mob rounded the corner into the alley, their faces lit by the glow of a phone screen. One of them pointed at Wyatt and Ezra, a cruel grin spreading across his face. There they are, he snarled, and the group surged forward. Wyatt's pulse thundered in his ears as the men closed in, their footsteps heavy on the cracked asphalt of the alley. Ezra's hand gripped his, their fingers interlocking with a desperate strength. Run, Wyatt whispered, but before they could move, a shout cut through the air, not from the mob, but from behind them. Stop! It was Margaret, her voice sharp and trembling, standing at the mouth of the alley. The men froze, momentarily startled by the sight of a middle-aged woman stepping into their path. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she held her ground, her purse clutched like a shield. "Leave them alone," she said, her voice cracking but resolute. Wyatt's breath caught. This was the woman who'd once called him a disgrace, now staring down a group of angry strangers to protect him. "Who the hell are you?" One of the men sneered, stepping forward. He was broad-shouldered, his face half hidden under a baseball cap, but his voice dripped with menace. The others laughed, emboldened, their hands gripping bottles and makeshift weapons. Wyatt's stomach churned. He wanted to scream at his mother to run, to get away, but his voice was trapped in his throat. "I'm his mother," Margaret said, her voice steadier now. She pointed toward Wyatt, her eyes locking with his for a fleeting moment. The weight of those words, his mother, hit Wyatt like a tidal wave. For years, she'd denied him that title, casting him out like a stranger. Now, she was claiming him in front of men who wanted to hurt him. The man in the cap laughed, a cruel, guttural sound. "Your son's a fag, lady. You okay with that?" The words were a taunt, meant to wound, but Margaret didn't flinch. "He's my son," she repeated, her voice rising. "And you're not touching him." Wyatt's heart twisted, a mix of disbelief and raw emotion. Ezra tugged at his arm, whispering, "We need to go now." But Wyatt couldn't move, his eyes fixed on his mother. The mob was distracted, but not for long. The man in the cap took another step toward Margaret, raising a bottle. "Get out of the way, old lady," he growled. Before Wyatt could react, the wail of sirens grew louder, and a police officer appeared at the alley's entrance, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Drop your weapons," the officer shouted, his gun drawn. The mob hesitated, their bravado faltering as more officers arrived, their radios crackling with urgency. The man in the cap cursed, tossing the bottle to the ground, and the group began to scatter, some slipping into the shadows, others caught in the officer's grip. Margaret didn't move, her eyes still on Wyatt. The officer approached her, his voice firm but kind. "Ma'am, you need to step back. It's not safe here." She nodded, her hands trembling, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she took a step closer to Wyatt and Ezra, who were still crouched behind the dumpster, their breath shallow. "Wyatt," she called softly, her voice breaking. He stood, pulling Ezra up with him, his legs unsteady. The officer glanced at them, assessing the situation, then waved them over. "You two, come with me. We're getting you out of here." As they moved toward the officer, Wyatt's eyes met his mother's again. She looked older than he remembered, her face lined with worry and something deeper, regret. He wanted to ask why she was here, why now, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he felt Ezra's hand squeeze his, a reminder that they were still together, still safe. The police escorted them out of the alley, past the flashing lights and the remnants of the mob, now subdued or fleeing. Margaret followed, her steps slow but determined. They were led to a squad car, where an officer took their statements. Wyatt's voice was mechanical as he recounted the night, the brick, the graffiti, the shouts. Ezra filled in the gaps, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Wyatt's fraying nerves. Margaret stood nearby, listening silently. When the officer asked if they had somewhere safe to go, Ezra mentioned a friend's apartment in Manhattan. The officer nodded, promising to arrange transport. But Wyatt's attention was on his mother, who was now speaking quietly to another officer, her hands gesturing animatedly. He caught fragments of her words. "My son, protect him. I didn't know." When she turned back to him, her eyes were wet. "Wyatt," she said, stepping closer. "I need to talk to you." He stiffened, his walls going up. "Not now," he said, his voice cold. "You don't get to just show up after everything." Ezra's hand rested on his back, a silent support, but Margaret's face crumpled, and for the first time, Wyatt saw her not as the unyielding woman who'd rejected him, but as someone broken, searching for a way back. The squad car hummed through the streets of Brooklyn, the city's lights blurring past as Wyatt stared out the window, his mind a tangle of fear and confusion. Ezra sat beside him, his hand resting lightly on Wyatt's knee, a quiet anchor in the storm. Margaret was in a separate car, following behind, her presence a weight Wyatt couldn't shake. He hadn't wanted her to come, but the officer had insisted. She'd been a witness, and they needed her statement too. They arrived at Ezra's friend Leo's apartment in Manhattan, a cozy fifth-floor walk-up with mismatched furniture and walls covered in abstract art. Leo, a wiry artist with a warm smile, welcomed them without hesitation, his voice soft as he offered coffee and a place to crash. "You're safe here," he said, glancing at Wyatt's tense expression. But safety felt like a fragile thing, easily shattered by the memory of the mob, the broken glass, and his mother's unexpected arrival. Ezra thanked Leo, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his face. Wyatt sank onto the couch, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in the alley, Margaret standing between him and the mob, her voice trembling but fierce. It didn't make sense. She'd spent years hating who he was, and now she was risking her life for him? The contradiction gnawed at him, stirring a mix of anger and longing he didn't know how to process. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, escorted by an officer who spoke briefly with Leo before leaving. She stood awkwardly in the doorway, her coat draped over her arm, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Wyatt. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He wanted to say no, to send her away, but something in her expression, raw, unguarded, made him pause. "Fine," he said, standing. "But not here." He led her to the small balcony overlooking the city, the night air cool against his skin. Ezra gave him a reassuring nod, staying inside with Leo. The door slid shut behind them, leaving Wyatt and Margaret alone under the glow of Manhattan's skyline. "Why are you here?" Wyatt asked, his voice sharp. "After all this time, why now?" He leaned against the railing, his arms crossed, trying to keep the hurt from spilling out. Margaret hesitated, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "I saw your name on the news," she said. "They said it was a hate crime, that you were in danger. I couldn't stay away." Wyatt laughed bitterly. "You stayed away for 7 years, Mom. You threw me out. You said I was dead to you." His voice broke, and he hated himself for it. He didn't want her to see his pain, didn't want to give her that power. But Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step closer, her voice trembling. "I was wrong, Wyatt. I was so wrong." He stared at her, stunned. Margaret had never admitted fault, not once. Her faith had always been her armor, her certainty absolute. But now, she looked small, fragile, her hands shaking as she spoke. "I didn't understand," she said. "I thought I was saving you, pushing you to be someone else. But I was wrong. And when I saw the news, I thought I'd lost you forever." Wyatt's throat tightened. He wanted to believe her, but the years of rejection loomed large, a wall he wasn't ready to tear down. "You don't get to just show up and fix this," he said. "You hurt me. You made me feel like I was nothing." Margaret flinched, but she didn't look away. "I know," she whispered, "and I'll live with that shame for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I want to make it right." Before Wyatt could respond, Ezra stepped onto the balcony, his expression cautious. "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Wyatt and Margaret. Wyatt nodded, though his chest felt heavy. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "We're just talking." Ezra hesitated, then stepped back inside, leaving them alone again. Margaret took a deep breath, her voice steadier now. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Wyatt. Not yet. But I'm not leaving. Not this time." She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm, but she didn't touch him. "I want to know you again. You and Ezra." The way she said Ezra's name, careful but sincere, caught Wyatt off guard. It was the first time she'd acknowledged his partner, and it felt like a crack in the armor she'd worn for so long. Wyatt didn't know what to say. The anger was still there, but so was something else, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. He looked out at the city, its lights a reminder that life went on, even after the worst nights. "We'll see," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Leo's apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Wyatt sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, his eyes fixed on the news playing on Leo's small TV. The attack on their apartment was all over local channels, labeled a hate crime, with footage of the broken windows and graffiti splashed across the screen. Wyatt's name wasn't mentioned, but the weight of exposure pressed down on him. Ezra sat beside him, his hand resting on Wyatt's arm, a quiet reassurance. Margaret was in the living room, speaking softly with Leo, who'd offered her a blanket and a place to sit. She'd insisted on staying nearby, refusing a hotel despite Wyatt's protests. Her presence felt like an intrusion, but also a tether to a past he'd tried to leave behind. He watched her now, her posture stiff but her eyes softer than he remembered. She was trying. He could see that, but trust was a bridge burned long ago. Ezra leaned closer, his voice low. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said, reading Wyatt's tension. "She's here, but you set the boundaries." Wyatt nodded, grateful for Ezra's steadiness. He didn't know how to navigate this. His mother's sudden reappearance, her apology, her willingness to face danger for him. It was too much, too fast. The news anchor's voice cut through his thoughts, reporting that several members of the mob had been arrested, but the investigation was ongoing. Wyatt's stomach churned. Their apartment wasn't safe to return to, not yet. Leo had offered to let them stay as long as needed, but Wyatt felt unmoored, like the life he'd built with Ezra was slipping through his fingers. Margaret approached the table, her steps hesitant. "Wyatt," she said, her voice gentle. "I spoke to the police this morning. They're increasing patrols around your building, and they've got leads on who organized this." Wyatt looked up, surprised. She'd been proactive, something he wasn't used to. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his tone guarded. "You don't even know me anymore." Margaret's face fell, but she sat across from him, her hands folded tightly. "I want to," she said. "I know I failed you, Wyatt. I let my beliefs blind me. But I'm trying to understand now. I've been reading, talking to people. I even went to a support group for parents." Her voice wavered, and Wyatt saw the effort it took for her to admit this. "I don't expect you to trust me, but I'm not giving up." Ezra's hand tightened on Wyatt's, a silent question. Wyatt took a deep breath, his eyes meeting his mother's. "I need time," he said. "This doesn't erase everything." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know. I'll wait." The day passed in a blur of police updates and quiet moments. Wyatt and Ezra helped Leo cook dinner, a distraction from the weight of the night before. Margaret stayed on the edges, offering small gestures, washing dishes, folding blankets, that felt foreign coming from her. Wyatt watched her, torn between resentment and curiosity. Who was this woman, so different from the one who'd raised him? That evening, as they sat around Leo's cramped dining table, Ezra broke the silence. "Margaret, why now?" he asked, his tone calm but direct. "What changed?" Wyatt tensed, but he wanted to hear her answer. Margaret looked down at her plate, her voice barely audible. "I was wrong," she said. "I thought I was protecting Wyatt by pushing him away, but I was losing him. When I saw the news, I realized I might never get the chance to fix it." Wyatt's chest ached. He wanted to believe her, but the wounds were deep. Still, her words lingered, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Ezra reached for his hand under the table, and Wyatt felt a surge of gratitude. Whatever happened with his mother, he had Ezra, his home, his strength. As night fell, Wyatt and Ezra curled up on Leo's pull-out couch, the city humming outside. Margaret slept in a guest room, her presence a quiet shadow. Wyatt lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but for the first time, he wondered if he could try. Days turned into weeks, and Wyatt and Ezra slowly rebuilt their lives. The police investigation led to more arrests, and their apartment was repaired, though the scars of that night lingered in the fresh paint and new windows. Wyatt avoided returning, the memories too raw, but Ezra's quiet strength kept him grounded. They spent their days at Leo's, planning their next steps, while Margaret hovered on the edges, her presence a constant question mark. She didn't push, didn't demand forgiveness, but she was there, bringing coffee, asking Ezra about his art, listening when Wyatt spoke. It was strange, seeing her try to fit into a world she'd once condemned. One afternoon, she joined them at a community center where Wyatt and Ezra volunteered, helping organize a fundraiser for LGBTQ youth. Margaret moved quietly, stacking chairs and sorting donations, her eyes bright with something Wyatt hadn't seen before, pride. One evening, as they walked through Central Park, Margaret asked to join them. Wyatt hesitated but nodded, and the three of them strolled in silence, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. Ezra broke the tension, pointing out a street performer playing a soulful saxophone tune. "Wyatt loves jazz," he said, smiling at Margaret. "He pretends he's too cool for it, but he's a sap for a good melody." Wyatt laughed, the sound easing the knot in his chest. Margaret smiled, tentative but genuine. I remember, she said softly. You used to hum those old Ella Fitzgerald songs when you were little. Wyatt froze, the memory hitting him hard. Sitting in their Georgia kitchen, the radio playing softly while his mother cooked. It was a time before her faith had hardened, before the rift that tore them apart. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, letting the moment linger. As they reached a quiet bench, Margaret stopped, her voice low. Wyatt, I need to say something. He braced himself, but her eyes were soft, not accusing. I was wrong about everything, she said. I thought I was following God, but I was following fear. I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me. Wyatt's throat tightened. He looked at Ezra, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. The anger was still there, a dull ache, but it was softer now, tempered by the weeks of seeing her try. He thought of the alley, her frail figure standing between him and danger, her voice claiming him as her son. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a start. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Wyatt said, his voice steady. But I'm willing to try. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, a shaky smile breaking through. That's more than I deserve, she whispered. Ezra squeezed Wyatt's hand, his warmth a reminder of the love that had carried them through. They sat on the bench, the three of them, watching the sun dip below the skyline. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still wounds to heal, conversations to have, but it was a beginning. Wyatt felt the weight of his mother's past lift, just a little, replaced by a fragile hope that maybe, in time, they could rebuild what had been broken. As they walked back to Leo's, Wyatt felt Ezra's arm around his shoulders, Margaret's quiet steps beside them. The city stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but also full of possibility. For the first time in years, Wyatt felt like he wasn't running from his past, but facing it, with the people who mattered most by his side.